As our state's population skyrockets in the years ahead, it means a lot more stress on our state's existing road and bridge infrastructure and the need to plan and build. We have a very distinguished first panel. Phil Wilson serves as the executive director, and they're going to make their way up. Phil Wilson serves as the executive director of the Texas Department of Transportation. He's a Lyceum director, and Phil has also served as Texas Secretary of State and as Deputy Chief of Staff to Governor Rick Perry, and we're proud to have him with us. Jeff Mosley serves on the Texas Transportation Commission. Jeff was most recently Chief Executive Officer of the Greater Houston Partnership, where he worked on transportation policy. He has also previously served as the Director of the Governor's Office on Economic Development and Tourism, and he was a county judge in Denton County. Michael Morris is Director of Transportation for the North Central Council of Governments, where he has been since 1979, and in this role, Michael and his team perform key work to develop transportation plans and programs that address the needs of the Dallas-Fort Worth region. And since last summer, Robert Talley has served as Division Administrator for the Texas Division of the Federal Highway Commission. And prior to this position, Bob headed the Indiana Division for more than 8 years, and we're glad to have him in Texas, and we appreciate him being with us today. Ray Wilkerson was appointed by Governor Perry to serve as the Chairman and Presiding Officer of the Central Texas Regional Mobility Authority. CTRMA's mission is to implement innovative multimodal transportation solutions here in Travis and Williamson counties. And Ray is the president and CEO of Ray Wilkerson Companies, a real estate investment firm here in Austin. And finally, it's a privilege to welcome our moderator, former Transportation Commission Chairman David Laney. David's practiced law since 1977. He served on the Transportation Commission from 1995 to 2001, and he was appointed by former President George W. Bush to the board of Amtrak. David has served in a number of business, government, and civic leadership roles, and it's our great privilege and pleasure to have him with us. It's a pleasure to have all of you with us today, and Mr. Moderator, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. Appreciate it. First of all, I've got to figure out how to work the computer. We've got a few slides, but let me first compliment the Lyceum. I don't know what it is that's the Lyceum draw, but one way or the other, you have attracted the very top of the food chain of transportation in Texas. This is a rare commodity to see all of this authority and capability and experience in one place at one time, so my compliments to the Lyceum. It's a privilege to be here with these gentlemen. Let me show you a few slides first to give you a little bit of an orientation. You got it a little from Dennis, but first of all, I have up on the screen the interstate system in Texas. If this was all there was that these gentlemen had to oversee, life would be easy. It's not the case. There's the Texas highway system along with the interstate system. It expands it slightly, the national highway system, and it adds another 12,099 miles. Again, if this was all there was to oversee, it would be a fairly simple statement. You add in the state highway system, which overlays this interstate and the national highway system, and you can see the level of the challenge. Over 80,000 miles, and some other challenges to go along with that. But this is really the challenge that in one way or the other, each of these gentlemen addresses every day, and with enormous creativity, I think you'll see, although it is in some ways challenging and maybe even a losing battle. We'll hear more from them as we go through some questions. Here's a sense of what we're facing in transportation. You can see the population projections from 2001 to 2040. That's the blue line. You can see the vehicle volume projections, again from 2000 to 2040, that pretty much aligns itself with population. And the vehicle miles traveled is a common measure of the use of our highways, and that again parallels slightly less, but pretty much on the same line as the population. We'll get into some issues with respect to possibly changing behaviors as we go forward over the next decades, but whether it makes a significant difference, we don't know in terms of driving patterns. That's the number of lane miles in 2001 and projected number of lane miles on a currently funded basis, current levels of funding in 2040. So you can see how the capacity that Dennis referred to that was originally more capacity than we could possibly envision using will be overwhelmed as we move forward toward 2040. And here are the funding levels, the various scenarios of the funding levels, and what it would take, and let me focus you on the blue line, the light blue line. It's what it would take from a funding standpoint to match more or less what we considered, what the 2030 committee considered peer or competitive markets, where we lose business to or we attract business from in terms of economic development. The existing funding line, if we stay at our existing funding line, you can see where we fall off fairly dramatically, somewhere in the 2020 range. And how we ever manage to raise the funding to levels even close to the blue line is a challenge. Again, these gentlemen may have more to say about tonight. So, let me now turn to the panelists. And I want to first ask each of them, one by one, to describe fairly briefly, if they can, and there are enormous challenges to making the descriptions brief because of the range of their responsibilities, but to describe the function of their organizations, where they operate and what they do. And I should say that this will be a difficult challenge for Phil Wilson because his organization is as wide-ranging as any in the state, and probably any in the country, and does more than we have time to hear about. But if he focuses on highways, and I should also say he is the alumnus, I believe, of the Lyceum. And
I graduated, yeah.
He's the one that somehow or other corralled us all here. And when we were sitting back in the back listening to Ray Benson sing, Phil said, I can do that. So he has promised, if he doesn't perform well enough during the Q&A, that he may stand up and do a song for us, but I won't hold him to that. Anyway, why don't we begin? Phil, with you, in terms of TxDOT and its role.
Great. Thank you very much, David, and I appreciate the opportunity to be on the panel today. TxDOT has a $10 billion annual budget. We have about 11,000 employees. Half of those employees deal with basic road maintenance every day. They fill potholes, they cut the grass, they stripe the roads, they make sure they're safe and they're operational. The other half are involved in things as diverse as doing procurement for comprehensive development agreements, which are toll roads, to finding financing, to working on right-of-way acquisition, to doing design work, to partnering with our local partners, whether it's the metropolitan planning organizations, regional mobility authorities, our Council of Government partners, and making sure we're advancing the projects and the Federal Highway Administration. So you have all the people we work with are on this stage today in a partnership endeavor. About a third of our budget to half right now is being spent on projects we've already let, that's the term of art we use, of having contracts on over the past 3 to 4 years. And that's what we spend our time every day doing. Designing, building, acquiring, procuring, and trying to advance a planning cycle so that we are, in a sense, hopefully 10 years in front of what we're trying to do. And planning is probably the most important function we have with our partners on the stage.
Thanks, Phil. Overseeing TxDOT is an organization called the Texas Transportation Commission. And Jeff Mosley is a member of that commission. So ultimately, he is one of Phil's bosses. But Jeff has a terrific background before he landed on the commission in terms of an orientation in Texas. When I first was involved in transportation, Jeff was involved in transportation in Denton County in North Texas. Then he was at the Economic Development Office here in Austin, and since has been in Houston. So he has a terrific overview of the various needs and challenges of different parts of the state. But Jeff, from the standpoint of the commission, why don't you give a sense of the role of the commission and your role on the commission?
Thank you, David. First of all, I wanted to say thanks to each of you who participate and give your time to come here to Lyceum events. We really are in a very wonderful, historic place. And because you guys come together and talk about topics like transportation, the state is extremely well served. So thank you for your time to come and especially to talk about this very fundamental issue about mobility Clearly, we all can agree that with a $1.4 trillion state economy, that mobility, transportation is the backbone of getting goods to market. As a member of the commission, there are 5 of us that have been appointed by the governor to serve in this voluntary capacity. Chairman Houghton of El Paso is the agenda officer, and so he works with Phil Wilson and with our professionals to put an agenda together for consideration by the commission. And then the 5 of us take up those action items and approve the action of the agenda for that month's priorities. So it's a real privilege for me to be appointed by the governor to serve in this capacity. We are given office at the Greer Building. We have a professional assigned to assist us. So in as much as it's a volunteer activity, I'm very pleased that we've got highly trained professionals that are helping guide us and inform us so that when we do make decisions, we're really making informed decisions. David Laney served as chair of TxDOT. We appreciate your service to the agency. But again, thank you today for this focus on mobility and on transportation.
Thanks, Jeff. There is a creature of federal statute called the Metropolitan Planning Organization that takes different forms, different names, and so forth. One of the largest, and I think by any measure, one of the more progressive MPOs is the Council of Governments in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, of which Michael Morris is the Director of Transportation. Michael, you want to give some sense of the role of COG?
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. When you go home tonight and say, well, what did I learn today? If someone's going to ask you when you get your first drink of wine on a Friday, the first thing you should say is, thank God we have people like yourselves and Chairman Mosley, Judge Commissioner Mosley, Chairman David Laney. This state has a whole bunch of folks that wake up every day and lead the future. And you're going to talk to legislators today, and that's the same. The second is, I don't know how this panel was put together. The second thing is, innovation can come from different institutional structures within the state. I happen to represent the metropolitan planning organizations. And the third thing you should get out of today is it takes a team to deliver transportation, have it be roadways or rail. And you're seeing that team here today. Metropolitan planning organizations under federal rules are to try to expedite transportation projects in the more difficult portions of our country, which are the urban regions. In the early 70s, the federal government said, look, we got state DOTs, they're doing a wonderful job getting between the cities. Somehow in these urban regions, they're much more complicated. Right-of-way is complicated. Public involvement is much more complicated. So in urban regions across this country, where the GDP, gross domestic product of this country is generated, remember 80% of the gross domestic product in this country is generated in the 40 largest metropolitan regions. So the federal government says, look, we got to create a more stronger institutional structure. There are 26 MPOs in Texas. There's 350 across the country, focused on this last mile, urban, balanced transportation system. In our particular region, I have 43 policy officials that sit on my board. They are the transportation providers of the region, and more importantly, they're the local elected officials. This is an unbelievable efficient structure. Think about it for a moment. The federal government coming up with rules and regulations to put a spotlight on urban regions in order to maintain and enhance the gross domestic product. Second, we operate at the pleasure where 50% of the authority rests with the local elected officials and 50% rests with the governor of the state. So anytime, if we're not doing our job, and we've been doing it since the early 1970s, some other institutional structure can be generated in our region to meet the needs of the region. And the third element that I think is critical is the people that set the tone, and we'll talk about the tone in Dallas-Fort Worth, which I think is pretty innovative, are the local elected official. They are the closest to the person that can vote them out of office. So you have the representation of public policy and transportation in urban regions by those that are and can be voted out of office. I have several board members here today who do this day in and day out, and they too are leaders in this process.
Thanks, Michael. Very little gets done in this state from a transportation standpoint relating to interstates or the national highway system or other aspects of our transportation without the involvement of the Federal Highway Administration. That's an important piece of the puzzle. It's an important part of the team. Bob Talley is basically the FHWA member assigned to this state overseeing it and interacting regularly with all the transportation authorities here. I want to give a sense of your role and your organization's role.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it is a pleasure to be here amongst this wonderful group of leaders in transportation. And I want to thank you all for being here because you're doing exactly what's necessary in terms of raising the bar about transportation during a very critical time, both in the state of Texas as well as nationally. And thank you for asking me to join you. The Federal Highway Administration is a U.S. DOT modal administration. It's under the executive branch of the President, and we serve under Secretary Ray LaHood. And we're here to serve, working together with our state, local partners, and other stakeholders in delivering transportation improvements across the United States. Our primary focus really is one of national interest, trying to promote innovation and streamline program delivery, which means how we try to get projects through this process, through the myriad of federal laws and regulations faster, more efficiently, and try to deliver those together with our partners in a way that really results in the outcome of a completed project. I often characterize Federal Highway Administration as having really two distinct roles. First of all, by law, we are a regulatory agency, not indifferent than any other federal agency. We are required to carry out and assure the compliance with all of the federal laws and regulations when it comes to delivering transportation projects. Our second role, though, is that we serve as a partner, and we do that in partnership with our state DOTs, our metropolitan planning organizations, regional mobility authorities, local agencies, and all the other myriad of stakeholders that are a part of the community to deliver transportation. And what I always tell people is if I do that second part and be a partner and do it in a way that absolutely is successful, I never have to wear the first hat, which is that of being a regulator. Because together we are all doing the same thing. We are all trying to deliver transportation projects and trying to assure that we get the best value for the transportation dollar that's invested and that we are compliant with all the necessary requirements. So we do that second part very well, and we don't have to worry about doing that first part. The last thing I want to say is that many people kind of confuse the Federal Highway Administration's role. When it comes to delivering the federal aid program, this is a federally assisted, state-administered program. It has been that way since its very inception with the first Federal Highway Act in 1956. And that model has worked very well. It has been very successful. So in that model, the Federal Highway Administration, US DOT, we do not select projects. We leave that up to our state DOT partners, our metropolitan planning organization partners, and the RMAs and the others who are involved in what projects are important. And they have certain requirements that they must meet and go through in order to do that. But once those projects have been selected, then we work together in partnership to assure that those projects are developed, that they meet all of the necessary federal requirements, that we get through that process and get them delivered in a financially acceptable way. And so that's a very important distinction that we often draw when it comes to what projects get built, that we do rely upon our state and metropolitan partners. But thank you so much for letting me be here, and I'm grateful to be a part of this great team.
Thanks, Bob. There's another organization that's, again, a statutory piece of the puzzle. It's the most recent of all these up here. It's called the Regional Mobility Authority. Ray Wilkerson has been the head of the Central Texas Regional Mobility Authority for 5 years or so. This is a slightly different beast with a slightly different role, but again, a complementary fit in the overall development of mobility and protection of mobility in a lot of ways. In this case, it's in Williamson and Travis County. Ray, why don't you give a little bit of an overview in terms of your role?
Thank you, Chairman. The Central Texas Regional Mobility Authority was created primarily because of lack of funds and need for regional and local control. Without this group our partnerships with TxDOT and with the counties and with the city and the consensus we've been able to build with the regional governments, we wouldn't exist. I'm proud to say we're years ahead of schedule. But in Austin, Texas, in Travis County, and Williamson County, you know, they're talking about the state going to double in 50 years. Well, this region's on steroids. So, you know, we may be ahead, but we're still behind. We may be 10 years ahead of schedule, but we're 20 years behind in need. So we have got a daunting task of which we couldn't do it without Phil and the commission and the federal highway. And so we have built, I think, a great partnership of consensus, and we are currently building roads. We have to be successful in what we do. We're not funded otherwise, so the projects we do have to make sense and they have to work. So we have been very fortunate in that we've received grants and we've received environmental help through, and Phil's been a great help with us in so many ways on getting our projects done. So
Phil's been a help.
We are doing a lot of projects right now, and we're looking to do a lot more in the future.
Thanks. Thank you, Ray. Let me give you a little added orientation. Then I'm going to pose a question for each of the panel members. First of all, you've seen the graph on the growth in the state. It's easily overwhelming the existing capacity. The same thing with funding. How do we get funding? The concentration of that growth is, quite honestly, north and south on I-35 and to the east of I-35. In the major metropolitan areas of the state, the Dallas-Fort Worth area, the Houston metropolitan area, San Antonio, the Austin area and its environs, those are clearly the most challenged areas of the state, not to mention the connections between those cities, those metropolitan areas. But we cannot overlook the importance of smaller metropolitan areas and even rural roads and connections. And then we have an enormous challenge along our border in terms of freight activities. So all in all, it is a very daunting future to try to address one way or the other. 10 years ago or so, there was still a concept in the energy area called peak oil. Peak oil was a concept that we were about to reach or had reached the peak, and everything was going to be in decline in terms of availability of energy from the Middle East or elsewhere. Technology, which we see in spades in Texas in the form of horizontal drilling and fracking, has basically thrown the concept of peak oil out the window as far as we can tell. Applying the same concept to capacity. And I'll ask this first of Phil Wilson. Are we at a place in time where we have really passed peak capacity and it will be in decline for the foreseeable future? Or are there technologies that TxDOT or you are aware of that may provide some relief or recreate a kind of capacity that doesn't exist right now?
Yes and no. So 1,000+ people a day coming. Congestion in the areas you talked about. Significant challenges related to that, and every tool being deployed that's possible with the existing resources we've got with all the gentlemen on this stage. At the same time, there's some really great technologies that are evolving that way. I had the chance to ride the Google car last month. It's kind of a freaky deal because you're going to I-35 at 70 miles an hour, and the driver turns around and goes, "Hey, how's it going?" Put your hands on the wheel, please. If you have a throughput like that, to your question, where you're able to put a multiplier on a highway because human error is in a sense eliminated because you have the ability for cars to communicate, that's evolutionary. That's a game changer. But it's not there yet. And so the interesting thing is we have an understanding of what we need now. Our maintenance is already $1 billion behind just taking care of the existing infrastructure. That won't change regardless. And then you have these capacity issues just to maintain, even with technology that evolves. So you have to have this build for the future because of the population growth and the method of finance hasn't kept up. But there are evolutionary technologies like the Google car or the ability to use RFID when you're traveling down the system to mitigate congestion. So your Bluetooth sends a signal that says, hey, up ahead, 20 miles, there's congestion, and you moderate your travel plans. So I think it's both in that scenario.
Jeff.
Chairman, I asked early on what would be the replacement cost of the Texas highway system, and the answer, kind of the back of the envelope, was along your lines: 90,000 miles of highway, 180,000 lane miles, $10 million a mile. You have about a $2 trillion asset. And then Lieutenant Governor Dewhurst asked us to, as an agency, identify the top 100 points of congestion in that road system. To get back to your question on capacity. So working with our strategic allies represented here on this stage and with our team of professionals and with limited resources, we're trying to very strategically invest in that priority list of congestion points, because a road system is technically speaking like a garden hose. When it gets a kink in it or a crimp, it ceases to have function. And by investing in these strategic points, we can keep mobility and keep goods getting to market and shore up this 1.4 trillion state economy. But I think it does take us into some very sensitive issues. Politically, managing capacity, as Phil has talked about, it's a difficult discussion for Texans. We Texans would like to build a roadway and walk away from it and let the road manage itself. And we're probably also, as much as we're talking about adding capacity and adding lane miles, we're also getting into taking technology that Phil's describing and seeing how it can help us manage that precious commodity called capacity. And then you get into charging for that peak demand. And maybe, that concept was rolled out in Harris County. And Harris County commissioners did what I believe is the right thing. And they said we should have the ability for a person paying a toll to pay a higher fee to guarantee the capacity. But the public support wasn't there for that concept, and so they had to back away from it. So I think the more that our driving public, motoring public understands the value of capacity, maybe that concept begins to get more traction. How do we manage trucks going through our strategic corridors? Is it appropriate during high peak demand to have trucks going through our center business districts, or are they better served to come through in off hours? These are very difficult political questions that have there's going to have to be a lot of public discourse on them. Yeah. But managing capacity will also have to be a very much a part of that discussion.
Thanks, Jeff. Michael, I know in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, because I see it daily, that there are a lot of moving parts and there are a lot of different strategies you have in your box of strategies, all of which seem to be active one way or the other. Can you give us a sense of how you've begun to address, or how the MPO in Dallas has begun to address the overwhelming traffic challenges that the other cities in the state are having right now?
Just to give this room some feel, and they probably already know this, but 100,000 people have moved to Dallas-Fort Worth every year since 1960. 5 million people. The population is greater since 1960 in Dallas-Fort Worth. I think you can say the same thing about Houston. You might be able to say the same thing of a combined Central Texas area. The traditional way to address transportation is in a set of tools about that particular size. Dallas-Fort Worth addresses transportation working in close partnership with TxDOT and in close partnership with the legislature, where the tools we use are the size of this particular room. You have to address transportation in your region like you would address a business. Go back to your graduate school economics class. The laws of supply and demand, which is the classic example you saw from the chairman's remarks and from Dr. Christensen's remarks. You cannot control the laws of supply and demand without the introduction of price. Your businesses are all over price points with regard to items. The leadership our region took 20 years ago is we projected a forecast of transportation revenue similar to what you see today. You could see increases in fuel efficiency due to the energy crisis. You could see the rising cost of construction, and you could see the rising cost of maintenance. And under federal rules, MPOs could not put into their transportation plan projects that you didn't have the reasonable expectation could be built. The greatest thing that ever happened to metropolitan planning organizations is the financial constraint requirement introduced in the 80s. It introduced honest conversation about the future of each of our regions. So we forecast revenue, we develop a policy that maintenance of the system has to be our #1 priority. How much money do we have left? This is how many people are coming. We simulate the transportation congestion levels, and our policy officials say this is unacceptable. What are we going to do? We did 3 things in 1993. The success of the Dallas-Fort Worth region is due to that decision in 1993. All new freeways in Dallas-Fort Worth will be built as toll roads. Horribly controversial in 1993. My phone doesn't even ring about toll roads anymore, other than, do you know I went from McKinney to DFW Airport on the new toll road and it's 25 minutes faster than it used to be? Or Arlington is now 30 minutes closer to Dallas because of the new toll road system. Number 2, all TxDOT projects, when that pavement gets old and has to be reconstructed, we're going to test to see if those express lanes could be built in the middle and you toll them. And you give a guaranteed level of service for someone traveling on that lane. So if you want to pay the toll on that freeway, you go in the express lane. If you don't want to pay that toll, you're going to get these beautiful new lanes built, continuous frontage roads as part of that system. And the third thing we said to the public, our elected officials said, we will not convert any, quote, free lanes, and there are no free lanes, so we use the term gas tax lanes. We will not convert any gas tax lanes to toll lanes. All future corridors will have equal or more capacity in the future. So in our particular case, Mr. Chairman, we believe we have to add more capacity. 3 million more people are coming to the region. Dallas-Fort Worth is a responsibility to help produce the GDP for this particular state. Congestion, bad air quality, and high accidents is an externality to a very successful legislative tax policy that's bringing all of this energy to San Antonio and Austin and Dallas-Fort Worth and Houston. So we're going to have to build more capacity. So that's maybe in that box. What else do we have to do? Well, we have to build more passenger rail systems. Rail systems are reliable. The issue we should be talking about is not the levels of congestion. It's the unreliability of the trip that affects what it is we do. Let's look at demographic trends. 20 to 26-year-olds, 20% of them don't have driver's licenses. You talk to them and say, well, why don't you have a driver's license? When I was 16, I got my driver's license 4.2 seconds after I turned 16. And I got my first speeding ticket 2 hours and 12 minutes after that time. A lot of the youth, this is their new automobile. And they'll pay a couple $100s a month to be able to do that. So up in that corner, what are the demographic trends we have to be sensitive? What's the role of passenger rail? Can we increase more telecommuting? Can we work with the private sector and deal with people officing more maybe out of the home? Can we work with large employers in this particular corridor, which has rail, and say, would you help on monthly transit passes? In this particular corridor, we may be initiating a carpool program to increase the occupancy. And I think the chairman's question, at least to Dallas-Fort Worth, is, yes, there's going to have to be some understanding that you can't build your way out of this particular solution. That's a regional norm, but it doesn't necessarily apply to each particular corridor. So go into those particular corridors, bring management strategies, money, innovation, and reach out to partners as part of the toolbox to solve those problems. If you do that, you create then a system of transportation, like running your own business, that does deal with the supply and demand and success of each of our regions.
Thanks. Ray, let me jump to you for a second. Michael's touched on this, Jeff's touched on this. I know Phil deals with it every day. If you had the ability to just impose on our current structure road systems what you wanted to do from an administrative or a regulatory or an authoritative standpoint, one way or the other, life would be simple. But as you heard Michael say, he tries a bunch of different strategies, and then when he began the toll road exercise in the 90s, there was enormous resistance and a lot of controversy. In the Williamson County, Travis County area, I know personally that in the 90s and into the early 2000s, there was enormous resistance for a bunch of different reasons. The not in my backyard crowd and very understandable and sensitive environmental issues that are probably more prolific here in Central Texas than anywhere else where the challenge is. How did you get from that point in time to where you are now? And even though you're still overwhelmed by traffic and having a hard time catching up, the fact that you now have planted toll roads on the ground with more to come with apparently no resistance or less resistance, how did you get from point A to where you are right now?
Well, you know, in Austin and Travis County, I don't think we could be sitting in a more environmentally or politically active area in the state. And I will have to say that through a lot of consensus building with the leadership and the business community and a lot of public outreach, a lot of hearings, a lot of explanation, and just by the sheer fact that it doesn't take, you know, rocket science to see it's no fun to drive down Mopac right now. You know, people are beginning to understand that they had to be in need of something. We are big proponents of the express managed lanes, in which we're getting ready to use on Mopac. And that is where you have to say it's time sensitive by price on how many cars go a certain time. And it's actually a management tool of managing congestion on these type of highways. So we will be using managed lanes and express lanes on a lot of our roads. The nice thing about how that works is that I think Phil mentioned a while ago that so much money is going now to just maintain these roads today. So if you have the managed lanes and express lanes on somewhere like so congested an area of Mopac, we know that there's probably going to be a nice cash flow on that. That money can be used also for going back and into that road to rebuild the infrastructure that exists today. Without that, I'm not sure that money exists. There are so many things that we have had to educate the public on to get their consensus and buy-in, but we've been very successful. And I will have to say that from the governor to our mayors to our councilmen to our county commissioners to our Chamber of Commerce's and we've been very sensitive in trying to work with the environmental communities and trying to gather acceptance into how we do these particular projects. One thing that worked very well that I think was very innovative, we received a grant from Campo for $130 million to build the managed lanes for Mopac. We agreed to Campo that we'd pay back $230 million into a transportation infrastructure fund that would go into that fund that would be used again in the Central Texas area for future projects. So what we have is a revolving fund that's rolling over, even looking toward the future. So we're trying to find ways that reinforce to the public and reinforce to our partners and reinforce to our public officials that not only are we building something today, but we're planning for the future and a way to fund that future internally so that we're not having to look for high taxation and we still maintain the roads that were there. We still have the choices they have, or you can use the managed express lane. So when you give all those choices to the public, we have been able to garner a lot of acceptance, and I'm very pleased to say that Mopac is about as sensitive as you can get. We had a tremendous buy-in to that, but that was because our staff worked diligently, and we had incredible help from our local senator, Senator Watson, and we've had incredible backup from the governor and everybody in helping us try to get that message out politically, environmentally, in any way we can. So we've been very, very fortunate in the fact that the acceptance has been much better than what we thought it might have been.
Great. Bobby, you've got all these guys in these various parts of the state pushing the edge with every strategy they can dream up. Pushing the edge and pushing the border of FHWA's patience, no doubt, at least their regs. Where do you find the most pressure and potential resistance from the federal side of things? Where do you all cross paths and bump into each other where you have to say, no, you can't go there?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I will say that, that's really not a word that's in my vocabulary, first of all. You know, I have been in this business for 30 years and worked in the state of Texas for now going on probably 10 or 11 years. And I will say that I think that Michael and the CTRMA and I know Harris County and NTTA, I think they're doing it right. And I commend them and I applaud them, because I think what Michael said is absolutely the most critical is having the dialogue that says there's a finite amount of resources, and when that finite amount of resources do not meet your needs, what is your next set of strategies? And it really does create the opportunity for the dialogue. I've seen that at the national level too, because if you think about what you're talking about in terms of how difficult tolling and the whole aspect of pricing and managed lanes and all aspects of congestion pricing, you've seen the federal government start down that path very, very slowly, because we did some pilots. We had our 129 tolling agreements and those aspects. We're now under MAP 21 mainstreaming many of those tools now and making them commonplace for states like Texas and Indiana and California and Florida to move projects forward. So I think you're seeing that the federal government is starting to also respond in a very similar way. And Federal Highway has been at the forefront of public-private partnerships and all aspects of innovative financing, because I think that's where our future is. And I always tell everybody on my staff and everybody I meet that in order for these projects to be successful, they need to have the ability to have some aspect of a revenue stream, whether it comes from a user fee, a toll, a tax incentive district, a tax recovery zone, whatever those tools are that are really at that local level and at the statewide level that have to come up with those. We're embracing those. We're embracing those aspects of ways to finance critical infrastructure. But I also say that it isn't just only building infrastructure, and I agree with Michael totally, is that this is a full suite of tools to be able to apply to our congestion problem, most definitely in the metropolitan areas. We find ourselves heavily involved in passenger rail. We're talking much more strongly now about high-speed rail in between cities in order to be able to move people through those systems. We're working in freight areas to try to get trucks into more dedicated service-type facilities in order to be able to minimize that interaction. We're doing better operations. We're doing incident management in terms of clearing vehicles out of the way when crashes occur and get the facility restored. So all these things are finally coming together in that very big suite of tools that are in that toolbox. And we need leaders like Michael and the MPOs and like Phil at the state and the RMAs to be able to embrace those. And what I'm so proud of is the fact that we're here and we're supportive and we are working together with these partners to be able to put these tools into place and deliver projects that are so innovative, because that's really where that future is.
FHWA has come a long way from when I was at TxDOT. And I think the federal strategy is to keep Texas from seceding from the union, keep us involved. But in any case, it is delightful to hear the complementary fit between the federal side of things and the state side of things. It's encouraging. Phil, let me turn back to you for a second. We've got this enormous pool of resources in the major metropolitan areas of the city and the major interstate runs in the city, in the state. You've got the same challenges in one way or another scattered throughout the state at one level or another. Perhaps not the concentration of those you get in a Houston or an Austin or a Dallas-Fort Worth area, but you cannot turn your back on the remainder of the state in terms of the importance from an economic standpoint, economic development standpoint, market standpoint. How on earth do you balance the needs first of all, the demands, and they are demands of the major metropolitan areas of the states, with the needs, which are continuing and continuing to grow, of the more rural areas of the state, and tying the two together.
I think that is the billion-dollar question. I grew up in Brownwood, so I kind of get rural. And Ray grew up in Breckenridge, which is very similar in tone and content and type of folks. And what's interesting that's happening in rural Texas specifically today is all the shale activity. And we'll go to that as a cost factor that even in my billion-dollar shortfall we've talked about for maintenance, we never anticipated the kind of energy growth that's taken place in shale the past 5 years in the state. Take the Barnett Shale in Fort Worth, you go to Eagle Ford south of San Antonio, you have the Haynesville in East Texas, and now you have the Cline play in West Texas, on top of Midland, Odessa, which has always been there. These are some really amazing numbers, if you like big numbers, because they're extraordinary to me. Every one well you drill, and most of these wells are in rural Texas, which is what's important part of this. Every one well you drill is equivalent to having 8 million cars drive on that road. And to maintain that well for a year is equivalent to having 2 million cars drive on that road. So a road that was built in 1950, 1960 is a farm-to-market road for your F-150 pickup truck is now trying to sustain and support an 80,000-pound truck. And so that's an enormous challenge. I see John Barton, my Deputy Executive Director and Chief Engineer, is in here, and John's led an energy task force for the past year. And we've gone around the state and talked in rural communities about this challenge. This doesn't even include the shortfall we talked about in maintenance. We estimate it's going to cost us up to $600 million a year for the state facilities alone to repair, to armor up, to put shoulders in, and to make the concrete thicker. And another $400 to $600 million for the county roads. So you've got the proverbial goose that's laid the golden egg, which is energy for this state, at risk because the transportation system, the very ecosystem of the lifeblood of this economy, is at risk. And so it's an enormous challenge, and then you put on top of that what I call, we've all used the term cone fatigue. You see orange cones everywhere and you think we have enough money. And then in 2 years we reach the fiscal cliff, which is the takeaway you should hear from today, is that our method of finance, which has been the gas tax, whether it be rural or urban, has not maintained with growth because it's a math problem.
Well, yeah, I know it's a continuing problem, and all I have to say is my compliments on how you all seem to be managing it. It's an enormous challenge. We're running a little thin on time now. Let me ask the panel, each of the members, one final question. If we have time for questions of the audience, we'll take them, but I'm not sure that we will after responses to this question. No, don't get your hopes up, Michael. You're not off the hook yet.
Well, I want to see what kind of questions I'd get.
We've talked about the growth of population. We've talked about the growth of vehicles, vehicle miles traveled, the virtual flat levels of funding and so forth. It wasn't that long ago where the chorus from anybody involved in the highway industry, surface transportation in Texas, was we had the best transportation, the best highway system in the country and maybe elsewhere. I'm not sure you hear that as often anymore because of all of the challenges. But the biggest issue from my standpoint is whether we have a highway system that's strong and robust enough to compete or to outcompete with the rest of our competition, whether it's somewhere else in the world or somewhere else in the country, and how we position this state to continue to lead the charge for growth, economic development, and economic opportunity, which impacts everything from education, you name it. Are we at risk? That's the question I have. Are we at risk of losing that position with respect to other states, any other states? Or do you see a bright, competitive, strong future for Texas transportation, considering all of these elements that are lined up against us? All right, let me start with you. Yeah.
Well, you know, in Austin, Texas, I think from the business Chamber of Commerce and the leaders that contact me regularly saying that the biggest impediment to us growing at an incredibly rapid pace is the fact that our infrastructure is the biggest question they have before they come to this area. Can we handle the traffic for the large employees and things that we've got? it's something that one, I think, that actually gives credence to the realization of why we have an RMA in the first place, is the fact that we've got to become a solutions organization, and we've got to answer the need, whatever that needs, as it calls upon us. You know, we're not here to force road zone. We're here to create a solution to help that commerce. One great example was 183A, which we were very fortunate to get a TIFIA loan. We were very fortunate to get a 25% loan from TxDOT. When that road opened, it was immediately cash flowing. In fact, it did so well that we're 7 years ahead of schedule on phase 2, and has created, I'm going to have to make a guess, probably hundreds of millions of dollars of commerce built in the Cedar Park, Williamson County area, from new convention centers to thousands of square feet of retail and regional hospital, that type of thing. We've seen what happens when we take an area that's underserved, can't handle the transportation. We solve that problem, and we can see the incredible returns on that investment that we get far over what a road system you would expect. So when that happened, of course, now then we are being approached by everybody from every sector of the area, of the county area, two-county area, of saying, you know, we see this happening. We've got to have this, and we've got to speed up the process. You know, we're in the perfect storm. The last few projects that we built came in under budget. It's the lowest cost of money we've ever seen. If we could get the environmental process narrowed down to a more reasonable time frame of approval on projects, then we're sitting at a time that, you know, we create hundreds of jobs with these roads also. So, you know, in a microcosm, we create our own economy. In the grand scheme of things, we build a huge lasting growth to our area. So this is the perfect storm for us to build projects as far as we're concerned.
Michael, what are the prospects for the future? Are we positioned?
I actually think we're on the verge of some positive things in this legislature with regard to transportation revenues in what I call layering the revenue stream. But I'd like to go in a different place. I believe, Mr. Chairman, that if we don't start doing things even radically more different, and people would look at what we're talking about today as different, but if we don't start changing our stripes, I'm not sure the traditional Texas quality of life and the ability of the state to compete will be maintained, because the externalities are too great: congestion, reliability, air quality, safety. Dallas-Fort Worth would not be successful if it didn't have TxDOT. TxDOT has an unbelievable capacity that this state takes for granted: designing of bridges, procuring systems, ability to do CDA contracts. If you add up all of their attributes, it is unbelievable. So why don't we all do things that we're good at and don't duplicate what we're doing? And let's look at tools that are somewhere else in this hotel and outside this room. Well, let me give two examples. Are we ready as a society for MPOs to lock hands with local governments and school districts and tackle the urban school situation, so the next 3 million people that come to the Dallas-Fort Worth region are just as likely to locate in central Dallas and Fort Worth as they are in suburban Rockwall or Collin County? If that can happen at some significant share, the quality of life in Texas can be maintained, because if those 3 million people are locating in areas that don't have any infrastructure, that's new sewage treatment plants, new roadways, new schools, are we prepared to really look at innovative ways? And you say, well, that's not really TxDOT's responsibility. We're going to hold MPOs accountable to work with their members and their school districts to see how this can be turned around. There are exemplary schools in urban districts, but the traditional transportation person with a PE license isn't cataloging exemplary schools in urban regions, and he or she, in my position, should be doing that. Let me go to a different layer, way above my pay grade. We hear, Mr. Chairman, We have a transportation problem, we have a future water problem, and a power generation problem. So at the highest level, are we prepared to go to East Texas and say, you know what? You need improvements to Interstate 20, we need cleaner energy to help us with non-attainment, and we need additional water supply. And I'm just picking East Texas because it's near me. There's probably 8 examples in the state. In this example, could we put together a mega deal that works on transportation, improved, more efficient power plants, and say water quality? And are we willing to take off our badge and throw it away and take some other combination of elements within, say, a public-private or within government and go over and tackle this particular thing? I remain hopeful, especially in this particular state. And I think it's time we be criticized for why is the MPO director spending time with school districts? Because maybe 10 years from now, 800,000 more people located in our central region, and we didn't need billions of dollars of transportation to meet those needs.
Now I'm going to ask it to the combination of Phil and Jeff. I'll put it to the commission and TxDOT. Are you guys overseeing as effectively as you can the decline of the Texas transportation system? Or is there a more positive future than the past?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm very bullish on the future of the state. I think we can all admit that the agendas that are facing our legislature, the agenda that we face at the commission, is a growth agenda. We're on a dynamic hockey stick of growth, as your slide presentation showed. And so that means that we must think very creatively and differently. And again, that's why I'm so pleased that you as Lyceum members are here to help us look for these workable big ideas in this very historic, wonderful time. I think we can also agree there are good problems and there are bad problems. And the good news is that we have a state that has opportunity, and that's why we see so many people moving here and voting with their feet to come here. And so that is causing us growing pains. We have more good news, and that is that the legislature has already given wonderful tools for local communities and the state to team up and partner, inviting the private sector to also be a part of those solutions. So the toolkit is really pretty full. And now it's kind of like the best idea hasn't been thought of. So there are challenges to be sure. We have a historic time in which to act. If we choose to take no action, I think it'll be a very less than desirable place in which we live. The wonderful news, again, is that we have a track record as a state. We have a seasoned team of lawmakers, beginning with Governor Perry throughout Governor Dewhurst and Speaker Strauss. Our lawmakers really have the ability to solve problems that are growth related. And so I have a lot of confidence in this state. We haven't talked about the demand for capacity on our 26 ports because of the Panama Canal opening a new shipping lane, Chairman. Again, I would put that in the good problem category, where vessels that today carry 5,000 boxes can carry 12,000 boxes through the Panama, and our ports necessarily should be working and are working to handle more tonnage, but that also means rail and highways working with our waterways can see more demand for capacity. We strategically are between the Rockies and the Ohio Valley, 100 million Americans, and so logically our Texas ports become a wonderful ingress-egress goods to global markets. So it's a great time in history that we live, and Phil touched on the energy sector, this renaissance in manufacturing, upstream, downstream. Again, Texas is wonderfully positioned. But these are growth agendas. It causes us to think differently. The models that worked so well after World War II, the power grid system that Michael talked about that worked so well since World War II, the World War II models probably need to be reinvented and reinvigorated. And I think we're up to that, Chairman.
Phil, want to add anything?
I think we are at an inflection point, and this is a time where decisions have to be made. use the word decline, and it will be a, I think, a fairly precipitous decline. In the next couple of years, we ought to okay to 2015, 2016. And then if we don't have new revenue sources identified, even with all the tools, just on our capacity, we can't toll everything. That's impossible to do. You have the rural parts of the state you mentioned. You have your interstate you have to take care of. And with the growth that's taken place, that in 2 years, without new funding, we'll be down to the same levels we were in 2002. So with all these new people, these 5 million new Texans that have come in the past decade, and we'll be spending less on highways in 2 years than we spent over the prior decade. That's a challenge. That's a math challenge. And so as you get to that inflection point with all the great opportunities, and I'm bullish, I'm like Jeff in the sense of Panama Canal, and NAFTA, the growth, the energy sector, all these huge benefits come into our state. But if you can't move people and you can't move product, you get a stranglehold, whether it's congestion or movement of freight and goods. So it's an enormous task before us that we have some tough decisions about how we do this.
Bob, you want to add anything?
Well, I guess from my perspective, looking at really kind of where Texas is sitting, I think Texas has done a fantastic job. TxDOT has in terms of our infrastructure. I mean, when you look at the quality of our roads and our bridges, our pavement quality is one of the highest. Our bridge numbers are still one of the highest in terms of those rated good or better. So I think Texas has done a lot of wonderfully good things in the areas that we've been talking about, which is congestion. Because of the growth is really the greatest demand. I love what Michael says because, I believe that the role of the metropolitan planning organizations in the metropolitan areas is evolving and changing because they're responding to what's going on and the linkages between land use, planning, all aspects of density, development, interconnections with transit and rail. All of those pieces all really do fit right into the metropolitan planning organizations. And they are a catalyst for helping move metropolitan projects forward as well. I've seen that successful in other states I've been at. So I know Michael's one of the leaders in that realm, and so I'm very proud and very glad that he's here helping lead that charge and doing that. But I think I wouldn't have moved here if I didn't think we didn't have a robust future, because I believe that as many of those who I'm sure have moved here feel the same way, that there's great opportunity. But great challenges come with that opportunity. And I'm proud to stand here with these gentlemen and be able to help meet those needs. I think the other aspect is that from a fiscal reality, I think at the national level, we see the ongoing discussion and debate. The president just unveiled his 2014 plan. Once again, the president put forward a transportation agenda that included a $50 billion investment in addition to the normal federal program at $40 billion for highways. It's really up to Congress to decide whether transportation, amongst all the other competing demands, is going to continue to receive the necessary funding just to continue to maintain the system that we have, not less expand the system that we have. I'm excited about the tools. I see, the continued aspects of the TIFIA loans that you mentioned growing. We have potentially $17 billion worth of TIFIA credit assistance that's available. There's talk about a infrastructure bank again being proposed, this time outside of DOT, for another $10 billion that would actually leverage $100 billion worth of resources. But while all of those things are excellent tools, they are debt financing and they do require a revenue stream. And I think the bottom line is what does that revenue stream look like? I love Dennis's graphic with regard to how much gas tax versus how much your cell phone cost. Clearly, we have a society who takes for granted the transportation system and the cost of that system, yet are willing to pay hundreds of dollars a month on a cell phone. And I think the reality is we have a commodity that is equal to or greater than any aspect of the cell phone industry, no disrespect to that industry. And I think we're going to see further tools that allow maybe the system to be used in a way that allows some of that pricing to be intertwined with the revenues that we already have. You see it in the managed lanes and you see it in the toll roads. So I think the future's bright from my perspective. The challenges are great, but that's why we're all here.
Thanks, Bob. Jeff, I'm glad you mentioned the port issue in Houston and the connectivity issue. I deliberately had avoided that because I think the next panel is planes, trains, and boats, and I hope they get deeply into that because there's enormous opportunity and comparable challenges.